Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Megan Jones. I'm with the National Weather Service office in Bismarck. I've got Matt Johnson here with me today. Thank you for coming to our Winter Outlook webinar. Just a few housekeeping things really quick. We are going to have plenty of time at the end for questions, so please feel free to put those in the question box. I can see Frank Ballack, you've already got a question in there. Is the slide deck going to be sent out or shared on the website? It is going to be sent out afterwards, as well as this recording. So you can put your questions in, but the slides and the recording will be sent out afterwards. Speaking of the recording, because this webinar is going to be recorded, we are following NOAA privacy guidelines in order to allow individuals access to the content, even if they are unable to attend the webinar in real time. By joining and participating in the meeting, consent is being given to the recording. For additional information, see the Privacy Act statement sent in the chat box. I think that's everything we have for housekeeping. So again, feel free to send questions throughout the presentation and we will get started. So like I said, my name is Megan Jones. I'm one of the meteorologists here on station at the National Weather Service office in Bismarck. The official winter outlook from the Climate Prediction Center was released this morning. So we wanted to get everyone together and talk about what that means for Western and Central North Dakota. Before we get too far into the winter, I did just want to talk about the next 6 weeks or so, the upcoming short-term outlook. This is the 8 to 14 day temperature and precipitation outlook. These are from yesterday. These actually just got updated probably a couple minutes ago, but it does go through almost the end of October. These are valid through October 29th. And you can see with the temperature outlook on the left that there is pretty strong red shading across the area, meaning that we are favored for above average temperatures through most of the rest of the month. And on the right, the precipitation outlook, you can see there's just a slight tilt towards below normal precipitation. So again, not a super strong signal, but some signs of a bit of a pattern flip compared to the cooler and wetter action that we're seeing this week. Then as we look ahead to November, the latest temperature outlook that was just released this morning, the temperature outlook is on the left and the precipitation outlook is on the right. I was a little surprised to see what the Climate Prediction Center went with. I would expect a lot of November to be near normal, if not above normal, especially that first half of the month before we maybe start seeing signs of more winter-like temperatures late in the month. But it is also interesting to see on the right, the precipitation outlook favoring us for above normal precipitation across the state. And as we'll see on the next slide, that maybe doesn't mean a whole lot, but it is interesting to see that the active pattern that we've been experiencing through this fall is favored to continue through November. So it's worth noting that it's really hard to talk about average temperatures and average precipitation in the fall just because things change so quickly. You can see in this table, this is the average high temperature for October and November are highlighted in that red box. On October 1st for Bismarck, the average high temperature is 66. And on the last day of November, the average high temperature is only 34. So we are going through a lot of changes in the fall. So keep in mind that when we're talking about above average temperatures through late October and into November, that does not necessarily mean 70s or even the 60s, especially later as you get later into November, that could just mean 50s. It's also important to note that the average monthly precipitation drops off quite a bit from October, where it's just under 1.5 inches, to November, where it's not even 3/4 of an inch. Those are values specific to Bismarck, but they are pretty applicable across the area. So again, just because we're saying warmer and maybe a little bit wetter or near average, it is still going to be getting colder through the rest of October and November on average. Now to get into what is certainly getting a little bit of attention, this is the official Climate Prediction Center winter outlook. And when we talk about winter, obviously we know that in North Dakota, winter doesn't last just December, January, February, the majority of years. We have more of the entire cold season, but this is the official meteorological winter outlook. If you've never seen these before, the temperature outlook is on the left-hand side of your screen and the precipitation is on the right. And then you've also got your legend down at the bottom that's going to give you the probability of being in that category. So on the left, for the temperature outlook, you can see North Dakota is in this blue shading that is equivalent to 40 to 50% chance of below normal temperatures. So again, it could be stronger. It's only 40 to 50%, but for a seasonal outlook, those are relatively good probabilities. It's the same thing with the precipitation outlook on the right. A lot of the times, the Climate Prediction Center does not go this aggressively with precipitation outlooks, especially for a whole season. So this certainly stood out to me. It stood out to our hydrologist, Alan Schlag, as well. And we were chatting about some of this yesterday. This is certainly something to be paying attention to, where you've got all of the state favored, at least leaning towards above normal precipitation. If you're in the southeast part of the state, that's the lightest green color, that's 33 to 40%. And then the rest of the state, especially the western half and kind of the northern section, is 40 to 50%. Also worth noting that extra green shaded area out in Montana is the 50 to 60%. So an even higher probability of above average precipitation out to our west, which could certainly have impacts in the spring. So we're just going to step through these. Oh, before I get there, I did just want to point out, even though we are favored for below normal temperatures and above normal precipitation, there is always a probability that that is not going to happen. That's just kind of the world we live in, especially with climate forecasting, where it can be pretty hard to categorize an entire season. So these pie charts are available on the Climate Prediction Center webpage. Again, we are certainly more strongly favored for near normal to below normal temperatures, but for the Bismarck area, there's around a 24% chance that we end up with above normal temperatures for that season. So now stepping through the rest of the outlooks, January, February, March, all of these seasonal outlooks are valid for 3 months. Again, the temperature is on the left and precipitation's on the right. You can see for January, February, March, that cold signal has not really changed at all. Again, in that 40 to 50%. Looking at the precipitation outlook for this period, still present across the majority of the state, maybe starting to get a little more into that equal chances in the far southeast corner. Equal chances does not mean that it's going to be near normal. If you didn't know that, it just means that there's not enough that we're seeing in guidance right now to kind of tilt one way or the other. But for the majority of the state, January, February, March, still seeing that signal for above normal precipitation. February, March, April, on the left, temperature outlook, really no change again. Still decent confidence that that cold signal is going to persist across the entire region, not just North Dakota. But as we look to the precipitation outlook on the right for February, March, April, we do start to lose that signal. Certainly a little less confidence in what guidance is showing, maybe some conflicting signals there from the forecasters at the Climate Prediction Center. So we are back in primarily that equal chances for above, below, or near normal precipitation, although there is still some enhanced signal across Montana. And finally, March, April, May, which is meteorological spring, that temperature outlook, again, unfortunately, it is still pretty focused over North Dakota, especially slightly higher probabilities in the northern tier of the state. So that there's some signals that that cold is going to last through the majority of the spring season. And then the precipitation outlook, we've really started to lose most of that signal, maybe a little bit more active to our east and northern Minnesota, but the focus there is going to be on the temperatures. So of course, when we're thinking about seasonal outlooks and how we get to what they look like, the main factor that we're going to be talking about is the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And if you've ever been on one of these webinars or you've talked to me about climate things before, you've probably heard of ENSO. So what it is it's a large-scale climate pattern that's based on sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific Ocean, where there's this interaction between the ocean and the atmosphere that leads to a really large-scale climate pattern that influences the globe. So it influences pretty much all of the circulations that we're seeing, especially in the winter. And there's two different phases. There's the warm phase, where there's sea surface temperatures in this very specific region are warmer than normal. And then there's the La Niña, which is the cold phase, where those temperatures are colder than normal. So we are officially in the La Niña phase. The Climate Prediction Center has put out a La Niña advisory, and you can see in this little graphic on the right that's kind of playing through, you can see that blue shading across the equatorial Pacific, which is indicative of those colder than normal sea surface temperature anomalies. They are favoring that La Niña conditions to continue through meteorological winter before eventually we're going to transition back to sort of the neutral phase of the ENSO circulation. So the question then becomes, what does this mean and how can it help us with our winter forecasting? We've talked about La Niña a lot the past couple of years. I think Matt and I actually just talked about this yesterday, that we have a lot more La Niñas than we do El Niños. So some of this information might be review for some of you, but we'll step through it. So typically when we have a La Niña, we end up with a blocking high pressure in the North Pacific Ocean that leads to a more variable polar jet stream, which makes it a lot easier for that colder Arctic air to filter into the north central United States, which includes the state of North Dakota. This has been a little more inconsistent since about 1990 or so, but we do still typically end up with at least something looking like this when we're under La Nina conditions. The one thing to note is that when we have a weaker event like we do right now, you are lowering the probability that you see the expected pattern. It doesn't mean that you won't get the pattern exactly and then it might be really intense. You're just lowering the probability that you see that pattern because other factors can come into play. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But again, we are expecting to transition back to ENSO neutral conditions sometime in the spring. And of course, then the question is, what is ENSO neutral? That's just when the ENSO phase is not in the warm phase and it's not in the cold phase. It's just kind of in the middle. It's not doing a whole lot. So we really become dependent on other shorter term climate features because the ENSO phase is just not dominating anything. So you can see in the bottom right, this little schematic, we have the ENSO neutral range is anywhere from +5 degrees Celsius to -+5 degrees Celsius. If it's warmer than that, it's El Nino. If it's colder than that, it's La Nina. The ENSO neutral atmospheric setup is actually pretty similar to that of a La Nina. It's just a little bit weaker. So again, other things can overpower that a lot more. This graph on the left-hand side of the screen is the official ENSO probabilities. The blue bars are the percent chance of La Nina conditions, the gray bars are neutral, and then the red bars are El Nino. And then along the bottom axis, you can see the season in each 3-month category. So SON is September, October, November, DJF is December, January, February, and so on. So you can see that right now, the probability of La Nina conditions is pretty high because we are experiencing those, but then they do drop off relatively quickly as we get past meteorological winter, and then the gray bars, which is the probability for ENSO neutral, starts to increase a lot more. It's also interesting to see that as you get later into late spring and approaching summer, that these red bars, the probability of El Nino conditions, starts to increase a lot. So that'll be something to be paying attention to for next winter. Since we have these weak La Nina impacts, these are composites showing the temperature anomalies during those years since 1950. On the left is October and November temperature anomalies, and on the right is December, January, February. Definitely some switch there from the fall to the winter. So in October, November, regionally, certainly a signal for above normal temperatures, which is typically what we've been seeing in recent La Nina years. And I think right now, I looked before this webinar, we're anywhere from 3 to 6 degrees above average for the first half of October across western and central North Dakota. So this is certainly coming true, and why I would expect those warmer than normal conditions to persist through a good portion of November. And then we'll get the flip, where at some point late November and December, that's where I don't have a ton of confidence in when exactly that will happen, but we do end up flipping to below normal temperatures. So again, this is on the right, the December, January, February temperature anomalies regionally, not just North Dakota, but across the entire Northern Plains, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Montana. It's a pretty consistent cold signal across that entire portion of the US. We also get asked a lot about snow, and I'm always a little less confident in snow and just winter precipitation in general compared to the temperatures, where that's a much more consistent thing across the area. But the snowfall patterns during weak La Nina years do support a more active signal. On the left is the seasonal snow total patterns for weak La Nina years. So again, you can see, regionally, the Dakotas and Minnesota, that there is a signal for above normal seasonal snowfall. And then on the right, it's just focused specifically on January through March, which there are some signs that during weak La Nina winters, you end up with a more active back half to the season. So anything kind of January, February, March, even into April. So again, you can see that same signal of above average snowfall across the region. And that is where it gets kind of hard, because sometimes you've got the snow in Bismarck, and that might not be the same as the snow amounts in Fargo or in Aberdeen or in Williston. So we try to talk a little bit more regionally about what the overall signal is for this part of the country. Now to go into a little bit more specific data, and we'll kind of walk through all of these columns to kind of give you the main point for these. We're looking at data for Bismarck for all the weak La Nina years since 1950. So again, these are kind of the comparison years we have to go off of. The other ones to really focus on are all these years with the little up arrow next to it, because those are the years that we transition to ENSO neutral late in the season. Some of the ones that stand out, obviously 2022 to 2023, which I think a lot of people remember because it was a very, very busy season. That was transitioning to ENSO neutral late in the season, but so were some other years like 2000 to 2001, 1983 to 1984, and then a few years before that. The first thing to point out is when we get our average first measurable snow for Bismarck. I know that we had just a little bit of snow in the Northwest earlier this week, but most of the time this is, they're going to get their snow a little bit earlier than the southern part of the state. So for Bismarck specifically, looking at the last 50 years or so, the chance for any measurable snow in this part of the state is very low before November 1st. And that would fit with the Climate Prediction Center outlooks that go through almost the end of October, favored for above normal temperatures. So overall, I would not be expecting to see much snow before November 1st. Now looking at snowfall for December, January, February specifically, there's actually not as much snow this time of year as you would maybe think. I think people think cold and they also think snowy, but that's not always the case. You do have a couple outlier seasons in there. Again, 2022 to 2023, which was very busy, 2008, 2009, and then 95, 96. But other than that, DJF snowfall during weak La Niña years is typically, skewing a little bit near to below normal. So again, just because it's a weak La Niña year doesn't mean that we're expecting a lot of snowfall during December, January, February. More so maybe the back half of the winter, although there is some signs in extended model guidance that is really favoring just an active winter overall, which is what we were seeing in the CPC outlooks. Then for seasonal snow, again, these can be pretty hit or miss. You've got those two, really big outlier seasons with at least 100 inches of snow. You've got another one of 80, and other than that, they're kind of in this 44 to 66 inch range. Average for Bismarck is 50.5, so that does kind of put it into perspective a little bit that we're on average not getting tons and tons of snow. So again, it can be a little tricky to kind of categorize the entire season, especially for one specific spot. But there are some historical seasons with a weak La Niña where we end up with quite a lot of snow. And to finish it off for December, January, February temperatures, again, I have much more confidence in temperatures than I ever do in precipitation. It is very unlikely that we will have a warm winter just based on historical data. It could be close to average, but the majority of the time it does end up colder than normal, which is what we're favored for. To talk about last winter really quickly, just because it was kind of interesting. When we had this webinar last year at this time, we were still somewhat expecting La Niña conditions, although we were not officially under a La Niña advisory. And this ended up not actually qualifying as a La Niña event because it was such a short duration. We eventually ended up hitting that minus 0.5 degrees Celsius threshold. It just did not last long enough to actually be an event. We did have a cold winter. I remember some really, really cold periods in both January and February, but we did have below normal snow during that period. And then we ended up warming up relatively quick through the spring, and we were warmer than normal for that period. And then we ended up with well below normal seasonal snow totals. I think Bismarck was only 25.3 inches, which is about 50% of normal. So that was certainly, for some people unfortunate, for other people not so much, but it was definitely less than what we were expecting last year. The one thing that was interesting is that we actually started to get above normal precipitation late in the spring. Obviously, that continued into the summer, and we'll talk about drought towards the end. But that was an interesting winter where we didn't have a lot of snow, but we did end up getting enough precipitation to help out with some of the drought conditions that we had and kind of cancel out the lack of snow. This is a little technical than most things we share, so I'll keep it as simple as I can. But these are box and whisker plots to show different precipitation spread during different phases of ENSO. And so this is valid for western and most of central North Dakota. December, January, February on the left, March, April, May on the right. What I really want to note is that looking at wintertime precipitation amounts, it doesn't really differ that much depending on the ENSO phase. So whether you're an El Nino or La Nina or neutral, your precipitation amounts for this part of the country are just not varying that much. If you start to look at the spring, that's where we see the real differences, which is also why, again, historically we are kind of favoring a more active back half to the winter and into the spring. You can see that with an ENSO neutral and a La Nina, that you're typically getting a lot more precipitation than you do under El Nino conditions. So again, that might be snow. It might not be snow like what we saw this past spring, but there are signs for more active weather as we go into the spring coming out of either a La Nina or an ENSO neutral conditions. There are plenty of other things that can play a factor, and we could talk about that forever. But if you ever see any of these oscillations or patterns or things referenced in any of our products or anything that we send out, there's a lot of information that goes into these. But what's important to know is that these have shorter predictability. So if we're in a weak La Nina or in an ENSO neutral, it's very easy for these other climate features to kind of overpower the base La Nina state. And so then that could end up changing what we end up seeing, at least on the short term. So think about kind of 2 to 4 weeks is where we're going to see the predictability of a lot of these. The two that I like to focus on are the Arctic oscillation. The negative phase of that makes it much easier to get Arctic air coming into the north central part of the US. And the Pacific North American pattern is also a big one I look for. The negative phase is our typical Colorado low phase. So again, if we're looking at, weeks 2 to 3, maybe even 4, and we're starting to see these oscillations and these patterns go towards a certain phase, that gives us a heads up that we might start to get more active and we might start to get a lot colder. The other thing that we look at is the Pacific Decadal oscillation. This is a much longer time scale climate feature. And there's been a lot of local research done actually before my time. So this was a little bit ago, but that was by Alan Schlag, our hydrologist, as well as a couple other forecasters. That it shows our historically bad winters or springs are with both a La Nina and a negative PDO. Yes, we have a negative PDO right now, but we have had those sorts of seasons and it hasn't been that bad. So it doesn't guarantee anything, but it is something that gets our attention when we're thinking about the winter and we're thinking about the spring, although it doesn't guarantee anything, especially in regards to spring flooding, which we know comes up quite frequently in questions. I also wanted to quickly touch on some longer term temperature trends, just because I think they're really interesting. And when we're thinking about La Nina and we skew towards a warm fall and a cooler spring, that works quite well with the long-term temperature trends that we're seeing over the past 30 to 35 years. So this graph is from the National Center for Environmental Information. This is valid for all of North Dakota, not just Bismarck or Western Central. And this is data since 1991. And so you can see that for September through November, the average temperature is increasing quite a bit. And you see the blue line is that trend line, and it's warming 1 degree Fahrenheit per decade, which is very noticeable. And I think if you've been around North Dakota long enough, I've only been around 7 years, and I feel like I've noticed it. If you talk to people who've been here a long time, they've certainly noticed that our falls are just getting a lot warmer. And then on the flip side, spring has been getting cooler, and that is also shown in the data. That's also pretty unusual because North Dakota and this region overall is really one of the only places that has some sort of season cooling in recent years. So again, this is from 1991 to 2024. This is the North Dakota average temperature for March through May. It's not as strong of a trend as in the fall, but it is still cooling 0.4 of a degree Fahrenheit per decade. Again, I think that's pretty noticeable that there's been a lot of comments made to us about how winter seems to just hang on into the spring a lot more. So this was also a factor in those outlooks where the La Nina favors for a warm fall, your long-term temperature trends favors a warm fall, and then the opposite in the spring, where the La Nina favors a cooler winter into spring, and then your long-term temperature trends favor a cooler spring as well. This isn't necessarily a trend, but it is interesting to look at seasonal snow amounts since 1950 for Bismarck specifically. The black line is the 1991 to 2020 average of 50.5 inches. We just wanted to point out it is pretty rare to have 3 low snow seasons in a row. So we had in 2024, I think we had 31 in Bismarck, and then last year was 25. And you can see just looking historically, it's pretty hard for us to have 3 seasons that are that low. Sometimes you get a season that's kind of right around average, maybe just a little below average, looking at like the early 2000s, looking at the early 1960s. But overall, historically, it just does not favor that, which, is not like the best reason to go with an above average snow forecast. But we did think it was interesting that just historically, that's not happened too often. So to kind of summarize everything that we've been talking about and what we're expecting, For temperatures, for western and central North Dakota, we're expecting near normal temperatures through the rest of the fall, if not maybe a little bit above, especially for the rest of October. At some point in late November to December, seeing that transition to winter-like temperatures, which will probably feel even colder than the temperatures are, just because it has been so nice the rest of the fall. And then once we settle into those winter-like temperatures, they're probably going to stick around January through April, potentially lasting into May. I do think that the bulk of winter and into the spring is just going to be cold. How cold, I don't know, but and we could see some warm-ups. We do typically moderate a little bit, especially in January. Before then, we really start to get cold again in February. For precipitation, not expecting that first measurable snow until November, especially across the southern part of the state. And again, like we've talked about, there are a lot of signs of an active winter overall. Historical trends are going to favor a more active back half of the winter, especially with that weak La Niña and some of the trends that we've seen. We also do typically get a December storm when we're in this pattern. How strong of a storm, where it is, that's still to be determined for sure, but we do typically see some sort of December storm when we're in this pattern. So of course, my guess, which should probably not mean a whole lot to you all because last year's was very off, but based on the previous winter seasons and kind of the forecast overall, my best guess right now for Bismarck is 60 to 70 inches. Again, our average is 50.5, and then slightly higher amounts to the north. This could be totally off. But it just seems like historically and with the forecasts and some of the things we've seen in guidance that we are just finally going to get more snow than we have the past 2 years. We do also have a local machine learning model run by our science and operations officer, Chauncey Schultz. If you have more specific questions about this, you will have to ask him because I'm certainly not an AI specialist. But we ran it, and it was interesting to see the results because it wasn't quite what we expected, especially with snowfall. It really does not like December, January, February snowfall. It's strongly favored for below normal there, but it does like the colder than normal temperatures for December, January, February, and then has that slightly favored to continue into March. What we thought was interesting that the model picked up on is increasing chances for above normal precipitation later in the season. So again, even though still favored for below normal in this random forest model, some hints of a more active back half of the season starting in January and kind of continuing into the spring months. Of course, just to kind of give a little follow-up for some of the spring precipitation amounts, as well as their temperatures, they can be pretty hit or miss, but what I thought was interesting is that if you're looking at all the weak La Niña years, all of them have had at least 3 inches of precipitation, specifically for Bismarck. So we're not really seeing dry springs, and a lot of them have ended up being more than that. So that was some good news that even if we maybe don't get all the snow we want, there are still some signs that spring will be a little bit more active, or at least not completely dry. And then the temperatures can be a little more variable as we get further into the spring season. You've got more seasons that are warm. You've got some more that are average. Still favored for cold, but certainly not as slam dunk as it feels like the winter months are. I did just want to highlight what happened last year. We had that borderline La Niña or ENSO neutral event. For spring, we ended up with over 7 inches of precip in Bismarck. A lot of that came in May. So it was certainly an active spring, and it was warmer than normal. And then again, our seasonal snow total was only 25.3, but we did have so much precip that ended up falling as rain that actually helped us out a lot with the drought conditions that we had. So not a lot of snow, but we did get the precip we needed. Finally, just for some bonus content, thank you to our hydrologist, Alan, because he helped me with these next 2 slides. If you have any hydro questions, you should probably go straight to him. But for drought, finally, some good news on the drought front that we really got rid of the majority of drought conditions this summer, and we've been active enough this fall to really not have a lot of drought concerns in the winter. The main thing we'll be paying attention to is what our snowpack looks like in the late winter and spring in terms of the runoff and then replenishing the soil moisture. So at this point, not a whole lot to say on that front, and that kind of ties into the spring flood outlook. Obviously, we can start to see some questions coming up with that with the above normal moisture forecast for North Dakota. But really, it's going to be too soon to know anything too specific about the spring melt season. We'll really have to see how the winter progresses and what sort of snowpack we've got, how late in the season is it, those sorts of things before we have more information on that. But we are always thinking about that, so certainly stay tuned. That is all the information I have prepared for all of you. If you have questions about the winter outlook or just climate things in general, please feel free to send me an email at any point. I've also got our Bismarck operations phone number on there. I'll be here until 4:30 Central Time today. If you want to call, if you've got more specific questions or need points for an interview or anything like that, I would be happy to help out. But with that, if you've got any questions, please feel free to put them in the questions box. I think while we wait to see if there's any questions, we do have a social media post out with the winter outlook if you need anything to share on your own pages. We also do have a short, more public-facing briefing that is linked on our webpage, weather.gov/biz. It's linked at the top. For as far as upcoming webinars, we are planning to do a midwinter update sometime in January, and then we will also be planning on doing some sort of spring and summer outlook probably in March, and that will be a lot more hydro focused, especially, so you can count on Alan to be there to answer lots of your questions on the hydro front. I don't know, is there anything I might have missed, Matt? Let's see, not seen any questions just yet. I don't know if I addressed it, but I think the other thing that stands out to me in terms of this winter that might be some good news is that with the tilt towards below normal temperatures, that does give a little more confidence that the majority of our precip events are going to be all snow, which I think is some good news, because obviously, 2 years ago we had that really bad ice storm out in the southeast part of the state with the warmer temperatures. Even, last year I think we might have had some mixed precip events. So that is the plus from our side, is that even if it's cold, it is a little bit nicer to just have all snow events and not really be dealing with any ice concerns. So we will have to see how the winter goes, but kind of a bright spot in all of that, because I know it looks very cold and a little snowy. Again, just to reiterate from Frank's question earlier, we are recording this webinar, so we will send out the recording, and then I'll also send out the slide deck as well. That way you can have all of the graphics and anything that you need in your email. So I will work on getting that sent out by later this afternoon. Doesn't look like we're going to get any questions. So I think with that, we will wrap things up. Thank you all for coming to this webinar and giving us a little bit of your afternoon. We really appreciate your time. And like I said, please feel free to contact us with any questions you have about the winter outlook. Thank you.